Hello and welcome to the current thing with me, Nick Dixon. And today we have returning to the show, a friend of the show, really, at this point, to tell us all about the Australian elections and explain what the heck is going on. Who better to ask than actual Australian and generally insightful person, Mr. Will Kingston? How you doing, Will?
Generally being the operative word. I'm good, mate. How are you?
Meaning not just because you're an Australian. And also, of course, host of the Fire at Will podcast, I should say that, and contributed to GB News.
Get the
Get
plug
that in at
in.
the start. Yeah, yeah. And I'm on nickdixon.net because you never know which bits I'm going to paywall, so we have to get that in. And Will, I thought it'd be brilliant to talk to you because I'm trying to understand what the heck happened in this Australian election. I know that much like Canada, the the libs suddenly won, or the lefties, against expectation, perhaps. So I've been trying to understand it. I actually watched your piece on the Spectator, and it was the most Australian thing. Like, we have such stereotypes of Australia, and you confirm them all. The guy who won is literally called Albo. It's like, yeah, Albo, mate. It's like, how can the leader of your country be called Albo? And someone actually said he'd be a good bloke to have a beer with. And at one point, one of your guests said, but he's a number 7 batsman. They put him into open. I was like, that's the most Australian thing I've ever heard. If you now mention kangaroos, everything we thought was true. So I'm sorry to hit you with the stereotypes, Will, but that was insane. I mean, number 7 batsman. Is that right? Was he a number 7 batsman put into
Yeah,
open?
yeah. So the guy who said that is a former president of the Victorian Liberal Party and a Liberal power broker. The Liberals are the equivalent of the Conservative Party
Yeah.
in Australia. And the way he referred to Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, who is called Albo by everyone, is a number 7 batsman, but not a wicket-keeper number 7 batsman, just a pretty useless batsman that somehow has found himself elevated to the top of the order, but he's managed to do a job. And that really was the case. He managed to do a job, but he is an uninspiring figure, not unlike actually. He's a different personality, but in terms of just being a pretty underwhelming person to run a great country, there are similarities with Keir Starmer.
Right, right. Yeah, that makes sense. I'm trying to think. Who was it? John Stewart, Jack Stewart. Was it? Who was it? We had a wicket keeper who was also a decent batsman back in the
Jack
day.
Russell,
There was Jack Russell. He was the wicket keeper. But I'm thinking of another one. Who's the other one? That wasn't it Stewart who doubled as a wicket keeper?
Alex
Because
Stewart.
Russell was a more. Yeah, 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 yeah. Sorry, because Russell was the actual wicket keeper, but Alex Stewart was like solid batsman and could do some wicket keeping. So
Yeah, that's
I
not
haven't watched
Albo.
cricket in years. Right, right, right. Exactly. So it's not that. I love that.
I'll give you the overview just so people know what the
Yeah,
hell
yeah,
we're
yeah.
talking about. Australia went to the polls on Saturday. It was a contest between, I'll be generous, the centre left Albanese government. I know a few people would say they're Marxist, but they're the centre left Albanese government that was voted in 2022. Uh, the Albanese government came in after I think just under 10 years of coalition rule, coalition being the Liberal Party and the National Party together. But for all intents and purposes, just think the Conservatives. Uh, that period was pretty underwhelming. Again, real parallels with that 14 years of Conservative rule in the UK where nothing really ever got done and it was just everyone was just disappointed. Same thing in Australia, basically, where the Conservatives were in for 8 or 9, maybe 9 years, and it was just a period of stasis. So Albanese comes in, and for the last 3 years, even I think supporters of Anthony Albanese would go, it's been an underwhelming period. So cost of living's been super high. There's been interest rate rise after interest rate rise. Half of his term was taken up by a failed push for a referendum for an Indigenous voice to Parliament. And as a result of just this feeling of malaise in the country, combined with high cost of living and inflation, the coalition was looking really good. They were 2 months out, leading in the polls, and everyone was expecting a coalition victory. Similar to Canada, about 6 weeks out, there was a remarkable shift in the polls, and people started to turn away from the coalition. And we can get to that and why that was the case. But the end outcome was a majority Labor government. You need 76 seats to form a government in Australia. Some people were expecting them to squeak through in a minority government. That hasn't happened. So, whilst people were expecting by the end that Labor would get up, they weren't expecting that they would end up winning 86 seats. At the moment, I think there's still at a few being counted, but it'll be around 86 to 87, that sort of area, which is a stunning result. And to give you an idea of the magnitude of it, it is the first time since the Federation of Australia in 1901 that a first term government has had a swing towards it in its first term. So, a really stunning result and a pretty searing indictment on the coalition right wing parties, given that the government over the last 3 years has not been good.
Hmm. Very interesting. Yeah. So we had an unprecedented thing with reform doing better than someone's done in 100 years in a way, like breaking the two-party system, perhaps. But you've had a swing to the ruling party unexpectedly, and it is difficult because all names are different. Now, aren't they? Like our Labour Party hates the working class, and our Conservatives are woke left. And like, it's very hard to pick up politics in another country. It's 'cause it's something you gain by osmosis. So when I look at other countries, they've all got these weird names that go against what they are, which we now have as
Yeah.
well. It is very hard to get. So, but as you say, the Liberals are sort of the Conservatives. So and Labour are still kind of Labour. But
Labor is Labor, yeah.
yeah, but do you want to say who you tend to vote for? I know you're a kind of libertarian type guy.
There is a Libertarian Party in Australia. It's at the moment depressingly small. I think they would have got about 1% of the vote, but that is who I voted for. Uh,
Right.
in the past, I voted for the Liberal Party, but again, this is an interesting story to tell because there are so many echoes with the UK. Um, the Liberal Party, I think, fundamentally in Australia have forgotten how to be conservative. They've forgotten how to be both conservative in terms of social conservative, that sort of stuff, but they've forgotten how to be liberal as well in terms of supporting individual freedoms, supporting economic liberalism, and that I think is one of the reasons for that from like extraordinary change in fortunes over that 6 week period. So
Right.
basically, what happens is number one, the Trump effect was very real in Australia. People looked at what was happening, particularly with Trump tariffs and the general uncertainty that that delivered, and went, "We don't want a Trump brand of politics in Australia." I think the coalition then got spooked and tried everything they could to disassociate with Trump and general like conservative politics. So they ran away from the culture wars. Dutton, when asked what is a woman, shied away from the question in the last week's of the campaign. Uh, he refused to ditch net zero and basically just provided a slightly softer version of whatever Labor was presenting on environmental policy and on economics, which is the traditional brand equity of the Liberal Party. You know, they're the ones that you generally vote for if you believe in lower taxes, fiscal responsibility, all that sort of stuff. At least for the 2 years after this election, they were forecast to increase the size of the national debt more than Labor, to the extent that if you actually hadn't put a title on the two proposed spending uh, the proposed spending for both parties, you would have assumed what the Liberal Party was presenting was a Labor budget or was the Labor Party's policies. So
Mm.
there's this again story which the Conservatives need to take heed of, which is if you just try and be Labor light, you're not going to win because people are going to go for the real thing. Now, and the Conservatives, I guess, are particularly screwed because they now have a strong challenger to the right of them, which people can just naturally turn to. But I think that was the story of the campaign, and that really people were going, I don't really see the point of voting for the Liberal Party. Like, what do they stand for anymore?
Yeah, it does seem hard to see the point. Was it something like the price of petrol or something, and some slight tax rebate or
Yeah.
something? Or
So that they were basically so cost of living, big issue, and housing affordability, big issue. Now the way that they were trying to address both was cutting the fuel excise, so the tax on fuel, but they were only going to do it for I think it was a year, and then they said we'd reassess. Hardly a groundbreaking economic reform, and I think for housing affordability, they were offering what was it? Um, you can dip into your superannuation or your pension. So Australia has a compulsory pension scheme called superannuation, and you can dip into that to pay for a house. And there were some little tweaks around tax which they were implementing. But again, it was all just this sort of marginal stuff. And Australia, which is in desperate need of economic reform, I think Australians looked at it and went, you know what? I don't, particularly when the world is so uncertain, I'll pick the lesser of two evils when I'm not being offered a compelling alternative. And the thing is, they needed to take a punt, the coalition. So a first term government in Australia hasn't been booted out in about 100 years. It's very, very hard to remove a first term government in Australia. Australians, for whatever reason, generally like to give governments a second chance. And so if the Liberal Party was going to have any chance, they needed to be bold. And in the end, they just weren't.
And I might sound stupid if I get this wrong, but isn't voting compulsory in Australia as well? So Tories here, certainly pre in the pre-reform days, famously just stay home if they're not happy. But I guess is that another reason the Labour did so well because people have to vote for someone.
Yes, I think that does favour the incumbent. Uh, there are a couple of other interesting implications, which I was just listening to on a podcast and I hadn't considered. Uh, Number one, the share of the vote had the highest percentage of female voters in Australia's history in terms of just demographics. So I think, and don't quote me, but something like I think there was an extra 500,000 female voters than male voters. And female voters in Australia have traditionally voted for have had the Labor Party, and that I think was a factor. Um, and the demographics skewed a bit younger relative to past elections, and older people generally vote Conservative. So there were a few demographics shifts at play as well, which again is something that the Liberal Party will have to think about because those demographic trends are only going further and further in that direction, and that potentially hurt them as well.
Yeah, very interesting. And this Trump factor, which I was going to mention, obviously in Canada, a massive thing. Sounds like it was a pretty big thing in Australia as well, even though comically Trump has no idea who Dutton is. He claims to like Albanese, and me and Albo, we're best mates. But this was pinned on very much like it was pinned on probably ever. And then the tariffs come out and it's a massive problem.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether Trump would be able to pick Albanese out of a lineup. I think he just says this sort of stuff. But yeah, it was ironic actually that he had no idea who Dutton was. Yeah, the Trump thing was a factor. If you look at opinion polling, most Australians are not supportive of Donald Trump, but most people therefore have said there is a lesson in that for the Liberal Party, and they need to basically move further to the left. They need to become more you know uh, that they need to become less conservative. I think the lesson is the opposite. Maybe not in the Trump type of. I think not in the kind of particularly the Trump style of politics, but I think it would be a big mistake for the Liberal Party to just try and move further to the left as opposed to actually standing for something on the right in politics. I think as soon as they did that, people just went, "There's no point to you guys." One other thing which I'd add in, which I forgot to mention earlier, if we're just looking at reasons for why there was this incredible turn in the polling in such a short space of time, there was a very effective scare campaign that was run by Labor. Uh, every 10 years in politics, and it's been the case for about 30 years in Australian politics, Labor comes out with a scare campaign that basically says the Liberal Party are going to end or reduce funding for Medicare, which is it's not quite the NHS, but it's our public healthcare system. Uh, and it's actually, again, some parallels in the way that Labor are going after Farage, saying that he's going to privatise the NHS, whereas Labor just says they're going to strip funding out. And from what I've seen, that scare campaign was very successful in this election, and the Liberal Party wasn't able to uh, to be able to confront it. And that partially maybe as a result of the leaders. So both of these leaders, Anthony Albanese who is now Prime Minister, and Peter Dutton, who was the opposition leader. He's lost his seat, as it turns out. He's the first opposition leader in Australian history to lose their seat in an election. Uh, they're both mediocrities. They're both political operators. If you put them in a back room trying to whip numbers, I'm sure they'd do it successfully. But Dutton had incredibly low favourability ratings. I think the lowest in modern Australian history. He's got very bad optics. Like he just comes across as a harsh-looking bloke. And
Yeah, I was going to say, does it matter that he looks a bit like a Bond villain? Is that a factor?
it doesn't help. It certainly doesn't help. He's not a likable looking guy. I don't think he's a bad guy, but he's got really bad optics and he's got no charisma, and he wasn't able to bring people with him if perhaps he was a slightly more likable political figure. But unfortunately, he's an old cop from Queensland, and he looks like an old cop from Queensland. And it's just that wasn't a charismatic figure that people felt like they could get behind. Whereas Albanese, again, also not particularly popular, which is why a lot of people are saying this was like the Starmer win, a Loveless landslide. but he probably wasn't quite as unlikable as Dutton was.
Right. And maybe not quite as unlikable as Starmer was. I thought that's what you were going to say.
No, no, well, I
Do you
agree
know
with that as
what?
well.
Yeah. So actually, very interesting. So it may be somewhat like here in that our Labour landslide has proved loveless now with the local elections. So maybe it's temporary this jubilation for Labour in Australia.
Yeah, exactly. This is not a strong base of support for Labor. If there was a compelling alternative, and if they ran a good campaign, and make no mistake, the Liberal campaign was diabolically bad. Um, I don't think I spoke to to Stephen Conroy, former Rudd communications minister in the Labor Rudd government, and he basically says we talk about who won the final week in campaigning as a key factor. But he said the Liberal Party didn't win a single day of the campaign,
Yeah.
and that's probably right. It was a really bad campaign. Um, but all that being said, Labor is not widely liked in the electorate. They still didn't do a good job in that first term, so there isn't that base of support. So the question is, if there was a solid alternative, would they have lost? And I think the answer is yes. The questions that are now being asked by many people are, what is the future of the Liberal Party in Australia? And particularly, could we be seeing, similar to what we may be seeing with the Conservatives, the end of one of the once great world conservative parties? And that is now very much an open question in Australia.
Yeah, and it does sound something Sunak-esque about their campaign, and now they've been obliterated. Who would replace them then? Because you've said there isn't really a strong alternative in the same way we have reform.
Yeah, that's the thing. And so that's why I think it's unlikely to happen, at least in the short term, because there isn't a reform alternative at the moment. There are a series of minor parties on the right in Australia. You have one which is led by a really interesting figure called Pauline Hanson, who's been in and around Australian politics for about 30 years. She's as close as we get to a Nigel Farage or a Trump. Big on reducing the size of immigration, big on attacking the impact of Islamic immigration, and then pretty protectionist in terms of her economics and pro tariffs and that sort of thing. I think they got somewhere between 6 to 8% of the vote in there. I haven't seen the exact numbers. And then there's a mishmash of these smaller right wing parties, the Libertarians. There's one which was funded by a billionaire called Clive Palmer, called the Trumpet of Patriots, which was a not so subtle way to basically say, if you like Trump in Australia, vote for us. Uh, and I think there was one or two others. Collectively, all of those minor right wing parties gained, I think, about 13% of the vote. Now, if you pulled all those guys together, again, it's not a winning tally, but it's enough to perhaps control a balance of power. And yet, you just have all of this fracture on the right amongst the smaller parties. So, uh, that is why the Liberal Party will still probably creak on in a way where the Conservatives may not now. But there is definitely a lane, I think, for a third party to be a genuine force in Australian politics in the same way that Reform is in the UK. But at the moment, no one is really jumping into that lane and running ahead.
Interesting. All right. Well, I find it fascinating the comparisons. Of course, it can be a dangerous game that. But one thing I noticed, just listening to you interview people on this, it seemed to me Australian politics was sort of more tame or a bit more dull than the UK, which obviously could be a good thing because we're in a sort of pre-civil war state. Some people think we're in a mess. And I wondered if that was because I had some theories. I'll try them out on you. One, you just have a better immigration system, this famous points based system we hear a lot about. And maybe that hasn't become such a tense issue as it has in our country, Britain. And then maybe is it also you just haven't had that moment? Actually, you're before us. You haven't had that moment where the two party system breaks. That was another thing I thought. And actually, they're just pretending that nothing's going wrong. There's and kind of carrying on as if business as usual. Maybe business isn't usual. There was some stuff about anti-Semitism you mentioned, so maybe Australia is sort of secretly on fire and they're pretending it isn't. These were just two guesses I had,
Yeah.
which are sort of opposite. What's the situation there?
On the second one, I think that certainly is the case. The first one, the immigration one, is more debatable. But you're right in that, from an outsider's perspective, if it had felt to you like this was a bit of a nothing, boring election, it was a nothing, boring election. I was speaking to a campaign strategist, and he basically said, I think quite memorably, this was the Seinfeld election campaign. It was the election about nothing. And
Right.
when you look at what the arguments are about. And if people are listening to this going, well, Will, what were the big policy debates? Why are you not telling me what this election was fought and won on? It's like there weren't really many. It really was an election about nothing. And in the end, the lesser of two evils ended up winning, or the lesser of two nothings won. Uh, the immigration question is interesting. If you look at immigration on a per capita basis, there has actually been more net migration into Australia than there has been in the UK in the last 5 years. Uh, so there is a huge change in the overall Australian population, which is coming from migration. But I don't think the cultural fraying is quite as bad. I think it's noticeable, particularly in parts of Western Sydney and regional areas in Victoria. And I've been wondering about this. Why is it that this is becoming such a fractious issue in the UK and it's slightly less so in Australia? And I think it is because the migrant populations are a bit more spread out in Australia. Whereas if you go into London or if you go into Birmingham, you see this very viscerally because it is quite concentrated in quite a few of the cities. Whereas I think in Australia, and I don't have any data to back this up, but I think that the migrant intake is probably more spread out over a bigger area. And so you probably don't feel the impact quite as much. But
Mm.
make no mistake, there is a huge number of immigrants that have come in. I think it's of gross immigration has been about 1 million in the last couple of years, and it's a population of 27 million people. One third of the Australian electorate, the voting age Australian electorate, was not born in Australia, which is a pretty extraordinary uh, data point. So there has been a huge change, but I think it is a bit more dispersed.
That makes sense. I don't know if there are particular issues around it as well. I mean, here, obviously, Islam, a particularly controversial issue. In America, it tends to be different issues, which tend to be more to black and white issues historically, for obvious reasons. I don't know, is there a specific twist on that in Australia?
Islam is becoming more of an issue, and I think particularly after October 7 and the a lot of kind of sympathy for Hamas, which again was partially from members of the Islamic community, and then also partially from the liberal intellectual classes as well. It's always that strange marriage between those groups. That is certainly there. You always got to remember as well that Australia will take more migrants from Southeast Asia and China compared to the UK. So that's still, I believe, where most migrants come from. Australia, I think it's still India, China, and uh, one other Indonesia. No. Um, but that's a variation when it comes to the immigration story compared to the UK. Uh, so I think that some of those cultural fractures in Australia are emerging, but I think they are still behind where the UK is, where you can feel for many people it is reaching a tipping point. I don't think Australia is quite there yet.
Okay, interesting. And so, yeah, one thing I really noticed was that economic concerns took over, and that debt seems to be a big issue that was on the table. Whereas, of course, we have massive debt in this country. We're spending insane amounts just to service the debt. So basically pay off the interest. It's incredible. If you think about it, you could go mad because we're just living in an illusory world of debt. But it's not really on the table as an election issue here. But it sounded like it was in Australia.
No, I don't think it was. I think that's the problem.
Oh,
So
sorry.
I think it's a problem for me anyway. Uh, in that, yes, debt is a massive problem. So I think, like I imagine the UK, and I definitely know, like the US, debt repaying or just paying interest on the nation's debt is the fastest growing line item in the federal budget, and the debt numbers are, reaching those sorts of scary levels that we're seeing in the US and the UK. Again, proportionate to the size of the economy. So it is a massive issue. But again, like the UK, like the US, no politicians really are doing anything serious to touch it. And this is a problem for Western politics, right? Because all of these politicians go, you know what? It's really hard to take money away from people. Most people in our day and age think me, as opposed to what is best for the country, particularly in an age when patriotism and is as low as it's ever been. So they go, you know what? They're 3-year terms in Australia. not 5. When the shit hits the fan when it comes to debt, I'm going to be long out of office. So why should I bother? And that's the problem. Like the incentives for politicians to sort this problem just don't align. And it will probably take a debt crisis in these countries for something to be done because there's no appetite really to address it at the moment. The other thing I'll just add on the economic issues in the campaign, to the extent that there were any, I think Australia over the course of the Albanese first term had 12 interest rate rises, and in a country like Australia where most people are mortgaged to the tits, that was really hurting Albanese. And again, that was one of the main reasons for up until 6 weeks before the election, the Dutton opposition was looking pretty good because people were going, it's costing so much for me to service my mortgage. We need to change this useless government. There was one interest rate drop in the lead up to the election. I can't remember. It was. I think it was in that 6 week period. I think that was just enough for some people to go, oh, okay, maybe the worst is behind us. Maybe things are on the up. And given that the Liberal Party has not offered really much of an alternative, particularly in economic policy, let's just stick with the devil we know. So that was also, I think, an important little turning point in the campaign.
All right. This is very interesting. Just overall, I just wanted to get your take on the UK elections as well. But overall, who is doing worse, Britain or Australia, sort of politically and socially, culturally?
Britain
Okay.
is the answer. Yeah, I would suggest. I think both. The interesting thing about these sorts of conversations is that so many of the same themes are popping up across Australia, across the UK. It really is fascinating, actually, darkly fascinating. But I don't think, for a couple of reasons, Australia is in quite as bad a place. Number one, I don't think the cultural, so the social fraying as a result of mass migration is as bad in Australia. Number two, Australia, at least for the foreseeable future, is in the fortunate position of having unbelievable natural resources. And whilst we can just keep digging stuff out of the ground and then flogging it to China, the economy will always be in okayish shape, notwithstanding all the debt and deficit stuff. But like that is what Australia has relied on for the last 30 years is just digging stuff out of the ground, selling it to China. And that's our economy, effectively. Now, if, for example, a war was to arise over Taiwan and that trading tap was switched off, Australia is stuffed, absolutely stuffed. Um, but until that point, the economy is actually, I think, in a structurally better place than the UK. And I don't think, I know it is growing a bit more than the UK is, which at the moment is just anemic. Um, so I think I think for the immigration reason, I think for um, the the economic kind of fundamentals are slightly better. Um, I think you're probably in a slightly better place in Australia than the UK at the moment. And then the other thing, which is also a good thing, is Australia's 3 year terms mean that we can probably turf out a bad government more quickly, whereas the Albanese government's going to go back for re-election again before the voters in the UK get a chance to turf out Starmer.
Right. And so, I mean, we face this to some degree, trying to balance the EU, China, and the US as a sort of mid-level power. But Australia must face that even more acutely. Then, if it kicks off with China in a trade war, do your guys have to be kind of like, "Hey, hear me out, mate. China's all right. I mean, like they can't get on too well with they can't alienate China trying to get on with the US."
Yeah, well, look, if it turned into a hot war, we would still be aligned with the US and the UK. There's no doubt about that. And the AUKUS agreement, which is Australia, UK, and US, was signed a few years ago now. Involved increased information sharing, buying a
Yeah.
lot of submarines from the US.
I
Uh,
meant I meant very much the trade war. China, as you said, there's potential for China to some way block exports of semiconductors from
yeah,
Taiwan to the US. That kind of thing puts US in a recession immediately, and then Australia's going, oh, hang on, we want to sell to China. Those kinds of things.
Yeah, and it is a bit of a complicated one. And China actually did tariff or put a lot of sanctions or tariffs on Australia in the last few years. So it is a bit of a tricky one. There have been some efforts to, I guess, further diversify our trading relationships. So relatively, we're doing more with India, more with Indonesia, but China is still the top trading partner for Australian natural resources. So yeah, the short answer is if there are to be, increased geopolitical tensions with China, that is a real risk for Australia.
All right. See, I haven't really thought about that. Call me naive. I haven't really thought about Australia's geopolitical risks, but now I will. I mean, what is your take then on our recent local elections? I say "our," it's always a bit confusing because you're Australian, but I mean in Britain.
Culturally
And
British.
okay, fair enough, which is nice. But though it sounds like you might want to go back to Australia if our country's really falling apart worse than you.
Yeah.
That's not a threat. Like, let's not send them back. Um,
You're starting the
but
deportation campaign a bit early.
let's start with some easy
Detain,
ones like Will. Yeah,
detain,
everyone will be on
deport,
board.
detain, deport.
Yeah, just start with the low hanging fruit. So, but what was your overall take on these sort of seismic shift everyone's talking about in British politics?
Yeah, stunning result. Absolutely stunning result. A couple of reflections. Number one,
All right, that is the end of the free episode. But if you want the full podcast, go to nickdixon.net for all the extra content, all my articles. That is my Substack, nickdixon.net. And we need your help to keep this whole thing going, keep the lights on, this amazing production, hiring people, etc. nickdixon.net to support us. It's £5 a month, which is about the cost of some sort of fancy latte in London, or there's a slight discount if you get the yearly option, or it's just £5 a month. So we'll see you on nickdixon.net, and thank you very much.